Hey everyone, I'm Mioang, and welcome to my new Beginner's Guide to StarCraft 2. This series of guides is aimed at players who are either extremely new to the game, curious about picking the game up, or just looking to try out a new race. If you're already a pretty experienced player, these guides won't be able to teach you much, but you can use them to convince your friends to give the game a try. These guides will be presented in a way that someone completely unfamiliar with StarCraft or RTS games will be able to understand. While Legacy of the Void is still in beta, this series of guides will be going over the game as it will be in Legacy of the Void. Many of the specifics of the game are subject to change, but the overall mechanics and concepts that these guides teach will be the same. The first part of the guide will be about the 3 races in StarCraft 2. A lot of the beginner's guides from the past skip over this part, and I think that's a pretty big mistake. When you first pick up the game and see how incredibly different the 3 races are, it can be pretty intimidating to look into each one and figure out which race is right for you. Now you might be asking yourself, why should I pick one race? Why not play all 3? While you definitely can play all 3 races, and many players do it very well, I can't recommend it to a new player. When you're starting out, it's important to really focus on specific parts of the game and refine your mechanics one at a time. If you're serious about playing all 3 races, then I recommend that at least you pick one to start with, then move on to another one after you have a firm grasp of the first one. This video will cover the general aspects of each race, and future videos will go more in depth into the tech trees and production of the 3 races. With all that said, let's get started. Terran. The Terran are the standard human race of StarCraft 2. In a lot of ways, Terran is the race that fits right in the middle between the other 2. Their units are generally not too expensive, but also not too cheap, while at the same time being not too weak and not too powerful. Some of their units are incredibly versatile, while others will only be made to fill extremely specific needs. What makes Terran the most unique is that the race has multiple ways to play the game, and they're all viable for every matchup. Legacy of the Void changes this a little bit from Heart of the Swarm with the new units, but we'll get to that later. Terran buildings can be constructed on any flat surface, and most of the buildings can be lifted off and landed at a new location. Terran has 3 production buildings, or buildings that can produce units, and several upgrade buildings, or buildings that you use to research upgrades for your units or enable the production of new units. The barracks allows the production of land-based infantry units, the factory allows the production of land-based mechanical units, and the starport allows the production of flying mechanical units. Terran workers are called SCVs. When an SCV constructs a building, the SCV must stay with the building as it is constructed. If the SCV dies or leaves the building cannot be completed. Unlike some other RTS games, only one SCV can work on a building at a time. Along with construction, SCVs can be used to repair Terran buildings and Terran mechanical units. Terran bases, called command centers, can be upgraded to either add utility with orbital commands or more defense with planetary fortresses. Orbital commands allow Terran to drop unique workers called mules, which only live for a short time but harvest minerals at a higher rate. Terran supply comes from buildings called supply depots. Supply is what allows you to create additional units. They are constructed by SCVs and can be lowered underground at will. They are often used to create walls and gates at specific points of the map, helping the Terran player play more defensively when they need to. Each of the 3 Terran production buildings can build one of 2 add-ons. The reactor allows the production building to make 2 units at a time, but it's limited to the more basic units from the building. The tech lab allows the building to create more advanced units and also allows you to research upgrades for units relevant to that building. When you lift off a building that had an add-on attached to it, the add-on will be left on the ground. Clever players can use this to swap add-ons around their buildings as needed, so that add-ons can either be built early or changed later on in the game. Terran has 2 somewhat distinct ways to approach gameplay. The first is called Bio, which refers to the biological units made from your barracks. In Bio play, the majority of your units will come from your barracks, while factory and starport units will be used to accent your army or fill very specific holes. Most notably, the medevac from the starport is used to heal your bio units and to transport land units in general. Bio play is characterized by the cost efficiency of its units and the extreme mobility that Terran's bio units have. The idea is to overwhelm your opponent with constant harassment and multi-pronged attacks that require a lot of multitasking from both you and your opponent. Bio play is typically one of the more active ways to play StarCraft 2 and often requires a very high APM, or actions per minute. If micromanaging your units all around the map sounds appealing to you, you might enjoy Bio play. The second traditional way to play Terran is called Mech, which refers to the mechanical units made from the factory and the starport. These mechanical units are much more expensive than the bio units, and also tend to be much more defensive and much more powerful. In a typical mech game, the mech player will try to set up an iron wall of defense until they're strong enough to either make a big push or attempt to contain their opponent and starve them out. In some games, the mech player will almost never engage the opponent, and will instead just cut the map in half with an impenetrable defense, and just wait until the opponent either kills himself or runs out of resources. If you can see yourself as someone who wants to defend until they're ready to attack, then mech play might be right for you. Now, you don't necessarily have to specialize in one of these two playstyles. Many players will use Bio for some matchups and mech for other matchups, or just switch between them whenever they feel like it. One of the biggest draws to Terran for me was this variety in playstyles, which made sure that the race never got boring or felt stale. In general though, Terran tends to be the hardest race for beginners. It requires a lot of game knowledge and multitasking ability, especially when playing Bio. With that said, Terran is generally considered to have the highest skill cap, which means that with practice you will have a lot of opportunities to show off your skill. Zerg. The Zerg are the more primitive, insect-like alien race in StarCraft 2. Their units are generally cheaper and more expendable than the units of the other two races, and they make up for it by being able to mass up these units quickly whenever necessary. Zerg is distinctly unique from the other two races because it has an additional resource, and all of its units come from one building. This resource is larva. All Zerg units are spawned from larva except for the queen, making it incredibly important to use efficiently. Larva is automatically created at each of the Zerg's bases, called hatcheries, at a slow rate. The most larva a single base can have at a time is 3. To help with this, Zerg has a unit called the Queen, which can spawn additional larvae at each base after a short period of time. Being able to constantly inject each of your hatcheries with larvae is one of the biggest things that separates decent Zerg players from great ones, and it's something that is essential to learning how to play the race. The other big thing that Queens do is spread something called creep across the map. This surface allows Zerg buildings to be constructed, gives Zerg land units more speed, and also gives the Zerg player vision across the map. Learning to constantly spread your creep around the map wherever you can will give you a huge advantage, often creating opportunities that wouldn't otherwise be possible. Zerg workers are called drones, and they are produced from larvae. The unique thing about drones is that they actually morph into the buildings that you construct, which means that you lose a drone every time you construct a building. Zerg supply comes from a unit called the Overlord. Like every other unit, besides the Queen, Overlords come from larvae. Overlords are slow floating units that can be used to scout the map and see what's going on all over. Zerg production is very different than the production of the other two races. Like I've said before, almost all Zerg units come from larvae, which are accessed at each hatchery. In order to enable new units to be produced, Zerg players have to either upgrade their hatcheries or construct specific buildings that enable new units. For example, constructing a roach warren will allow larvae to be used to create roaches. What makes Zerg production truly unique though is that as long as they have larvae and resources available, the Zerg player can simultaneously produce as many units as they want. So while a barracks can only produce 1 or 2 units at a time, a Zerg player with 20 larvae and enough resources could produce 20 units all at the same time. This mechanic is what allows Zerg players to master units late game, and is an essential aspect of the race. To further elaborate on that, let's say that you have reached the maximum amount of units you can make, which is 200 supply, and that you go into a battle. If you lose 100 units worth of supply in that battle, as long as you have resources and larvae available, you can immediately go back up to 200 supply, while opponents of other races will replenish their armies much more slowly. To allow this sort of gameplay, Zerg players typically focus heavily on their economy, and will often create new bases as quickly as possible to allow for more larvae and more income. Because of the larva mechanic, the Zerg player can focus on building drones to help their economy when they're safe, and then switch to focus on units when they need offense or defense. If playing as an economically focused swarm race sounds appealing to you, then Zerg might be the right choice. It's the most unique gameplay out of the 3 races and rewards good reactive play. It requires you to scout your opponent almost constantly so that you can make units that will work well against what your opponent is doing, but it also allows you to completely switch up the kind of units you're producing so that you can keep your opponents guessing. Protoss. The Protoss are the spiritual and technologically advanced alien race of StarCraft 2. Their units are the most expensive, but also tend to be the most powerful. Their gameplay centers around very cost-efficient units that you try to keep alive for as long as possible to outvalue your opponent. Protoss is unique because they warp in their units and structures. Their most basic units can be directly warped in almost instantly at any location that is powered by a pylon. Pylons are the structure that Protoss uses for supply, and they also power all of the Protoss' buildings. In other words, all Protoss structures must be built near a pylon. If the pylon is destroyed, the building will no longer function until another pylon is built. This warping mechanic allows Protoss units to be instantly produced anywhere on the map with a pylon, which means that they can have very powerful attacks with reinforcements at key points in the game. This also means that Protoss can quickly rebuild their more basic units when necessary, as long as resources are available. The other unique thing to Protoss units and structures is that they all have shields. Shields will automatically regenerate over time, but any damage that goes through the shields cannot be repaired. Protoss workers are called probes. They construct buildings by warping them in. A probe simply has to travel to the intended location for the building and start the warp. After the building starts to warp in, the probe is free to do anything else it wants. Protoss unit production is extremely similar to Terran, besides the warping mechanic. Protoss also has 3 buildings for producing army units. The Gateway produces land-based, basic units, and these are the units that can be warped in at pylons. The Robotics facility produces robotic units that tend to be either essential to a Protoss army or fill some other utility role. The Stargate produces most of Protoss's air units, which are usually used situationally. Protoss bases, called Nexuses, have an ability called Chrono Boost. Chrono Boost allows a building to produce units or upgrades faster than they normally would, and effective use of Chrono Boost is essential to playing Protoss well. All of the timers for Protoss were designed with Chrono Boost in mind, so neglecting it will just set you behind. Protoss players usually win in one of 2 ways. They either commit to very tight, aggressive attacks at specific times when their efficient armies are very strong, or they wait until late in the game when they can build a large army of extremely powerful units. Most commonly, Protoss players will go for a strong push, and if it doesn't go their way, try to play defensively until they have an extremely powerful army. If an extremely cost-effective army with powerful units sounds appealing to you, Protoss might be the way to go. Many of their units have unique abilities, and all of them are formidable when used well. A well-constructed late-game Protoss army can be nearly impossible to overcome. Now that you've heard the basics of the 3 races, you probably have a general idea of which ones you're interested in. I encourage you to go play a few games with the races that excited you the most and try to figure out which one feels right. I've personally played all 3 races for extended periods of time, and they all have things that make them both engaging and enjoyable, so you really can't go wrong. When the tutorial is completed, it will cover the general gameplay flow, the tech trees of all 3 races, how to use control groups, how to use hotkeys, how to read and use build orders, how to manage your economy, and how to micromanage your units. Thanks for watching, and good luck picking up the game.